Welcome to Champaign County Agriculture Today. My name is Dennis Riggs, your host for the program. Thank you for tuning in as we explore the issues of agriculture here in Champaign County. With us today, we have a great guest, Tamara White from the Illinois Farm Bureau in Bloomington. Tamara, tell me a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and your job responsibilities there at the Illinois Farm Bureau.
Sure, Dennis. Born and raised in Minnesota to a family farm operation of sorts. My dad was the seventh of 8 sons, so I have several uncles who were in farming. Both my grandfathers were. I went to college out at Stanford in California, and then went all the way to the East Coast and worked in Washington, D.C. for 12 years in ag policy, international trade, and marketing. And then I thought, well, it's time to put that to work, so I came out here where the rubber meets the road to work for Illinois farmers.
Well, that's great, and we're glad to have you in Bloomington at the Illinois Farm Bureau. We appreciate that. Of course, I'm serving on the board of directors of the Champaign County Farm Bureau right now. And of course, Farm Bureau is an organization that tries to put together policy to help agriculture be strong, kind of like a chamber of commerce for agriculture. Is that the way you see your job at the Illinois Farm Bureau?
Absolutely. I mean, I tend to work in international trade and marketing, but of course, Farm Bureau works all the way from the local level up to the international level, trying to help farmers at every step of the way to either produce better or survive the latest regulations or taxes, all the way to marketing and selling overseas.
Very good. We know agriculture is a very important industry, and we know that it affects our economy not only just here in the local level, but we have a slide that actually goes into the Illinois effect of agriculture. Slide 12 there talks about the effect of agriculture in Illinois. Give us an idea, you on a statewide basis, of how agriculture affects the state of Illinois.
Well, agriculture is huge in Illinois. We produce about 20% of the nation's corn and soybeans, and we also produce a significant number of cattle and hogs. And if you look at our processing industries here in the state, we employ several 100,000 people in jobs in Illinois. I think it's close to 1 million people in ag-related jobs, everything from a Kraft Foods or an ADM to a John Deere or a Case IH. You've got every step of the way, including trucking, railroad transportation, locks and dams, food companies like McDonald's. All of those are somehow involved in the ag chain.
You know, when you have so many people eating 3 times a day, it just keeps a lot of wheels turning, not only on the state level, as you just mentioned, but also on the national level. We have an additional slide that talks about the importance of agriculture in the U.S. economy. Let's take a look at that and explain, is agriculture a big part of the U.S. economy?
Absolutely. Well, and if you look at, I think the slide shows 11.3% is the ag, food, and fiber sector, and then the non-ag is 88.7%. It is a significant part of the economy, agriculture is, especially if you combine the ag, food, and all the industries that support them, whether it's packaging, advertising, financial services. It's a significant part of the economy, and it's one where we're very fortunate that it not only contributes a lot to our trading balance, in other words, we export quite a bit of agricultural products, but it also contributes an enormous amount of money to rural economies via the tax base, via jobs, via investment in rural areas by farmers, etc.
Okay, so let me get this straight. Agriculture affects the state, it affects the nation, but it also comes back right here at home to help our local school districts. Give me an idea, I guess on my local tax bill would be the best track I could find of the things that agriculture helps support on a local basis.
Absolutely, and if most of us who are maybe not owning a farm, but we own a home, we look at our tax bill and we all want to go on permanent vacation because we think, I don't have a child in school and yet I'm paying $6,000 in taxes this year. Imagine if you're a farmer and you have 400 or 500 or 1,000 acres of land. Agriculture pays an enormous amount of taxes to local school districts in Illinois, in Champaign-Urbana, and so I think you have a slide that shows the Unit 116 Urbana School District, $6,773,760 in tax revenues. It's an amazing thing to live in a state where, you know, north to south, you're from Wilmington, Delaware, all the way up to close to New York in terms of length. And in all that area, yes, you have a few big cities and a lot of consumers paying property tax there, but you have tens of thousands of farmers in there paying property tax that goes towards local school districts, local tax, road commissioners, etc.
Is this something new? And of course, I'm asking you this question. I kind of know the answer because I have my tax bills laying on my desk back at the office also. Is farmland always paid the majority of local property taxes and the assessment of the capital? Is this the right way of doing it?
Well, the beauty of living in the United States is that everything, we are guaranteed life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and private property. And so one of the things that comes with having private property is the ability of the government to tax it or to tax the value that you can make off of it. And so it's something that's fairly similar in every country I've traveled to around the world, unless the government held the land, like back in the communist days in Russia. When people, private citizens or businesses own land, they usually have to pay tax to the government for it.
So I guess a way of putting that is the worth of an area, so you'd be a county or a road district or a school district. Matter of fact, we have an example of the Prairie View Grade School District right here in Champaign County in slide 15 there, talks about how much of their value of the surrounding area is made up by farmland.
Right.
Is that right? Over 54%?
Yep, that's right. And, granted, farmers tend to own a disproportionate amount of land compared to an average consumer, but at the same time, they're taking on the risk, the production, the upkeep, the maintenance of that land. If water runs off it and, goes over the road, they have a lot of responsibility for that land, and I think it's good for everybody to realize that they're paying taxes on that and they're contributing to local schools.
Now, tell me this. Out in my area, I've got, where my house sits, southeast of Sydney, I farm and run the farm around there. But around me, there's a lot of people that live in the country, yet they work in town. Now, they don't own land. They own their house, whereas my land is owned by my sister and my mother and us, and we pay all this assessment. I know the Farm Bureau's been working on an idea. That lawyer that lives down the road from me that may be making a salary higher than I make on my farming operation doesn't pay as much for their tax bill. Is that the right way of doing it?
Well, I'm sure probably not according to you, maybe according to the lawyer, but I think there are a lot of folks looking at a lot of different ways to assess taxes, and particularly when you look at who's benefiting from them versus paying the tax. And I think here in Illinois in particular, farmers are paying a lot of the tax burden, and yet they are in underserved areas sometimes relative to whether it's a fire department or a 911 service. It's no fault of the local community, but they are just simply underserved because they're not in an urban area. So I think it is something that we'll all be wrestling with well into the future.
So this dilemma of finding a way to support our local agencies has gone back many years and has been based on the farmland ownership system or property ownership system. Is there a move, or is there a thought about changing that in the future?
Well, I think probably what you'll see happening is as time marches on and as rural economies perhaps become more diversified to include other industries beyond agriculture and agri-food, you have coupon processing in some areas. You have huge trucking and distribution networks. And I think as those tax bases broaden out a bit and more businesses come to rural areas, you'll probably find very clever and more fair ways to balance that tax burden.
Well, the farmer has to find a way to pay for those taxes and pay for those input costs and pay for the machinery and just upkeep of the farm. That means he has to sell to somebody.
That's right.
Your work with the Illinois Farm Bureau also has to do with commodities programs and how farmers can move on and sell to markets, both international and domestic. Give me an idea of what things you do in your job to help farmers find the market for the products they produce.
Absolutely. Well, and one thing I should say up front is you're very fortunate here in Illinois, and you have a lot of small and larger companies that do all that work for you. And so when it comes to what does Farm Bureau do, sometimes it's just a matter of pushing that envelope just a little bit further, trying to get things like permanent normal trading relationship with China several years ago, working on a conclusion to the World Trade Organization talks so that we have more market opportunities. In some cases, we'll actually take trips overseas and we will try to show farmers what it's like to market in a foreign country so that they'll take home something like, well, I heard from the Japanese that they'd like a higher level of protein in our soybeans. I'm going to tell that to my checkoff board when I get back to Illinois.
So you're telling me that somebody that wants to buy my soybeans that I produced here in Champaign County wants to talk about how they're produced, what type of work has to be done to talk to that soybean consumer in China? Is there you have to take product to them? Give me some of the tricks of the trade there.
Well, in oftentimes, especially on the big sales, it takes the big multinational. They're the ones that have the resources not only to get the large shipments to a place like China, but also to do all the paperwork and the legal work and the contracting and find an importer to do the large scale, large volume crops. In other cases, you'll have like Lynn from Cerro Gordo, Clarkson Grain. They identified specific niches, consumers who wanted organic or non-genetically modified soybean products for health foods. So they went to Europe, they went to trade shows, they met the buyers, the consumers, the companies that wanted to buy that product. They went to Japan and they developed the relationships then and spent all the time to develop the relationships, to do the export documentation, to sign the contracts, to contract with producers for the product, etc. And it's a lot of work. It's not like you're going to drive down to the car dealership and sell them your used car and take on a new one. It is an enormous amount of relationship building, legal work, travel, foreign travel, which doesn't agree with most of us here in Illinois. And so it's a tremendous amount of work that I think Illinois is very fortunate to have a lot of small and large companies that'll do that for you.
Illinois ag products are not necessarily the easiest to handle. They're in bulk commodities, as in corn, soybeans, wheat, oats, and of course livestock also. But we have a slide that talks about Illinois ag exports, and it looks like we're doing a pretty good job. Give me an idea of what types of products and where they're going from your viewpoint in the export market of Illinois ag.
Absolutely. Well, Illinois' the U.S. top markets, I should say first, are Canada, Mexico, Japan, China, and probably the European Union, which is the European, the 7 or 8 or 9, I think they're up to now, countries in Europe that are major trading partners. Our top markets here in Illinois are very similar, with probably Canada, Mexico, and Japan playing a disproportionate share, and also the European Union. And I'll tell you a few things that we ship to each one. In the European Union, we sell them corn gluten. We sell that to the Dutch dairy producers, and that corn gluten is ground in the wet milling process, for example, down at ADM in Decatur, and that goes to dairy cows in Holland. We also sell a lot of processed corn products and soybean products, as well as some bulk products on both sides, corn and soybeans, to Japan. And in Japan, they're using it for feed, and they're also using it for soy foods. To Mexico, again, we're selling feed or feed products. We sell some bulk corn. We sell some food-grade corn for tortillas, for example. Canada, of course, we may be buying durum wheat from Canada at times. We might be processing it into pasta, which we then sell back up to Canada. So a lot of those products, not a lot of exports on dairy, but on dairy processed products like you'd see made here at Kraft and Champaign, those products would be going to many, many markets overseas.
We often hear the term used in exports of value added. Give me an example. You have hit actually a few, or maybe it's better to ask, is it important to export value added products as well as bulk commodities, or is that good for workers as well as other companies?
I think if you look at what a country does well, and the United States is certainly technologically advanced, it would be silly for us to think that we can be competitive worldwide into the future just selling bulk corn and soybeans. We've got the technology, we've got the fermentation techniques, we've got the big companies willing to make an investment, you've got the university people looking always for new products. So you want to add, to me, as much value as you can to the product to sell it overseas. And the other good thing is that oftentimes when you're selling that more expensive product overseas, whether it's a chicken breast or it's a special beef product, or maybe it's even tofu, it's a lot cheaper to move that little box of tofu in a container vessel than it is probably to move bulk grain all the way over there and then get $2.50 a bushel for it. So I think that value added not only adds money to that end product, but it also creates jobs here in Illinois or down in Louisiana, wherever the processing chain goes along, maybe in the Texas feedlots where they're feeding out cattle with our corn. So that whole chain, wherever you can create the value, create the jobs, add the tax infrastructure here into the United States, that adds value to agriculture.
American agriculture is a big business, and there's a lot going on. If you mentioned many of the jobs and companies that are involved in that. Are we the only ones in the world doing this type of thing, or do we have competition when it comes to bulk commodities and value-added commodities?
Well, we definitely have competition. I think you could go to any farm meeting and they'll tell you the ones they worry about most are Brazil and Argentina. There are actually very few countries that can compete head-to-head with us on all the products that we produce. But if you look at Brazil, for example, and Argentina, they're producing soybeans, and they can compete with us on bulk soybeans as well as meal and oil. Now on corn, Argentina, yes. Brazil, not so much, but it's coming on. In corn, you have more competition in markets we're trying to be in Asia, where China produces corn, not as well as we do, but they have government export subsidies for corn. So their corn feed products do compete with us over in Asia. But again, we have head-to-head nobody that can quite produce exactly what we do. Canada and Mexico might be the closest because they'll do the feed grains as well as livestock products. And of course, once you've added the value to get it into pork or beef, and then you lose a market to somebody else, that's a huge hit.
American consumers many times see the products that we produce here in the United States, agricultural products that is, but they also see daily on the shelves of all our department stores many items that are purchased from other countries. It's called trade, and it's called a trade deficit many times because the American consumer has not only an appetite for food, but also an appetite for electronic goods, maybe manufactured items. Is it important that agriculture help out in the trade balance with our nation against others?
Absolutely. American consumers definitely love imports. In fact, I think one of the things I've discovered since moving more into an area where there are consumers is that they love just everything about anything. Flags for different seasons, decorations for their house for different seasons, a new beer, a new wine, a world market, and all those things, especially the handiwork and the things like flags, plastics, toys, all of those things come from other countries. Shoes, apparel, perfumes, many of those things come from other countries, and that's terrific. Those countries do those things very well. We produce agriculture and food products very well and very reasonably priced. We're very good at it, and that makes us very huge exporters of agricultural products and food products around the world. I think Illinois' ag exports are $4 billion a year. That's a huge amount. I think the U.S.'s are around 60 billion, 63 billion maybe for last year. So one of the things that's nice about agriculture is we can't eat everything we produce. So we've got corn, we've got soybeans, we've got beef and pork that we can export to other countries who may not be able to produce them themselves, or if they could, they wouldn't be affordable. So those countries like China, Indonesia, Malaysia, where their economic standards are increasing, they can buy beef from the United States, maybe in a nice restaurant a couple of times a year now, and that gives us a market, and it's good for them because they're realizing the benefits of their rising economic status.
Okay, I as a farmer produce my corn and my soybeans, and I have to get it over there. Let's talk about transportation for a second. We mentioned how it's not as easy to move a bushel of corn as it might be to move a gold watch. We've got a slide that talks about how we move a lot of our commodities. It's called a barge. We see them up on the Great Lakes. There's a picture of the barge there. Let's talk about our transportation system. What kind of shape is it in right here as we move this big commodity to be exported?
Well, we've got, with the exception of, I know people would complain about weight limits, we've got pretty excellent local roads, township, county, state highways, and then we certainly have a tremendous interstate highway system in this country. That is probably unparalleled anywhere. It's certainly not in Brazil and Argentina. We don't have highway robbery here or hijackings of trucks like they do in Brazil. So we've got a tremendous, with the exception of the volume and maybe the price of fuel right now, we've got a tremendous highway transportation network. On the railroad side, we've got some limitations, some areas that are no longer served, but still relatively good transportation networks in the railways. And then on the river system, we've got a tremendous system of rivers, Where we have the challenge is we haven't made an investment into them in almost 50 years. And so we're working with 1930s technology on major thoroughfares, that is our rivers and our lakes, that we could be using to efficiently moving agricultural products, but those have not been improved as they should be.
Is the river system the most economical way to move a bushel of corn from central Illinois to the Gulf for export?
Well, I certainly, and I don't have these numbers ahead of me, but I remember our ag director used to cite frequently how many more semi-trailers you'd have to have on our highways to move the grain that is currently going up and down the Mississippi. And so I think not only is it more reasonable, but you don't have to have those trucks idling in the winter to stay warm and pulling off and using the highways that our children, our grandparents, and our relatives are traveling down, because they're going to be going down the river. So I think it is not only reasonably priced, but it's a very safe way for things to move, and also there's some great benefits, environmental and others, to consumers to having those riverways open.
Let's talk about our competition for a second. I know Brazil is producing a lot of a product. We have a slide that shows the Brazil river system, shows a vessel being loaded. I'm going to let you tell me, I think you've seen this slide before.
I have.
What advantage or disadvantage do they have over our system?
A Panamax vessel that actually in the Amazon is wide enough that it can turn all the way around there, I think, just beyond that facility that's shown in the slide. And I believe that one is majorly from private investment. In other words, in Brazil, the government has not maybe made some of the infrastructural investment that you have seen, for example, in China, where they've spent $50 billion to build the Three Gorges Dam and a series of locks. In Europe, they've spent about $18 billion in the last 20 years to upgrade their canal system for moving grain. But in Brazil, if they've spent that much, it's mostly been by private investors or individual large farmers and some companies to go ahead and have this kind of infrastructure, which is putting them at a tremendous potential advantage over us in the future if we don't keep up.
Can American agriculture and the American transportation system meet those challenges? Where should we be looking at to upgrade our infrastructure so we can compete with something that's as natural as a huge river going up through the middle of Brazil?
We absolutely can. I think the challenge is in a more developed country like the United States, we always have competing interests, and then we always have to have a public debate. And so the question is always, is it more important that river is recreational use for boaters or fishermen, or that this part of it be used for commerce? And I think that question, if you pose it to consumers as, do you want this many more semi-trailers on your highways, or would you like to see that river moving grain, 3/4 of the year? I think most consumers will probably come out very close to where industry and agriculture are in terms of moving things, because we have to keep in mind, we're not just moving crops. We're moving coal, we're moving fertilizer, and sometimes we're moving petroleum products up those rivers, and you can't fly that stuff in very cheaply.
That's right. That barge that goes south on the Mississippi River full of corn will probably come back with something else in it, and that's a good two-way street. All right, we've talked about transportation. What are some of the other issues that we are facing as far as trying to stay ahead or competing with our foreign trading competitors?
Well, one of the biggest things, we call them tariffs, and tariffs are taxes, and I'm sure we'll all remember the Boston Tea Party. We didn't like it that we were over here in the United States, and I think the British were charging us huge taxes and prices on bringing their tea in, and I think our colonists dumped all the tea into the Boston Harbor. Well, tariffs in other countries are a nice way, especially for a developing country, maybe run by a dictator, to make money, because he can say, oh, those Mars candy bars that are coming in at 25 cents a piece, we're actually going to charge 50. The importer's going to have to pay 50 cents for them, and we, the government's are going to get 25 cents a piece. So tariffs on imports are a way that developing countries and others either try to make money or they try to keep your products out. So, for example, in India, maybe they'd like you to use palm oil. They don't want you to be importing lots of soybean oil, but the consumers think the soybean oil is right cheap, so they'd like to buy it. The government will then put 150% tax on soybean oil coming from the United States, and that's a huge barrier to us getting our product into that country. And that's what the World Trade Organization are trying to do, is bring all those barriers down to a level playing field so everybody's competing on the same game plan.
So with all these problems involved, that bushel of corn that I raise on my farm that has to make it to China to feed a cow over there or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of trace that for me a little bit of what hoops it has to jump through,
Sure.
both policy and transportation-wise, as it makes its way across to its final consumption?
Sure. Well, let's say your bushel of corn goes into one of the local processors here, local elevator. It's going to be probably weighed and graded, and you're going to get a price based on its quality or its weight or its moisture content or whatever, or lack of. That's going to go into the processing field, and that company's going to process it for whatever it might be that China wants. Now, let's just say China's buying distilled dried grains from that, and they're going to use them in their dairy rations. That product then is processed and tested at the processor, and then it gets loaded probably onto a container barge, goes down the Mississippi to the Gulf, and probably goes through the Panama Canal over to China. Although there are products that are getting railed up to the west coast of the United States and shipped out there on ships. Once it gets into China, every step of the way there's somebody, it seems, that's involved. And we always like to complain about the middleman, but there's got to be somebody at that port that calls in to the ship gets clearance to dock, they're asked what's on board, there's customs papers, there's importers they have to deal with, and that ship's probably not just carrying distilled dried grains. So there's all of these hoops that have to go through before that distilled dried grains can get offloaded and then sent to whoever needs it. And oftentimes in China in particular, you would see people with motorcycles, and on the back of their motorcycle they'd have a bag of seed grown in the United States to plant corn or something, and it would just be that on the back of their motorcycle. That was their purchase for the day. But in the case of distilled dried grains, you're probably going to a fairly large dairy operation in China, and you've got pretty large multinational companies dealing with that infrastructure the whole way. And one of the great things for corn and soybean farmers in the Midwest is that you do have 4 or 5 major multinationals that are world powers in grain trade and their byproducts, and so they take care of all the paperwork for us.
Sounds like a long and tedious process, but it's an important process for our economy. For our consumers that are watching today, in just a minute or so that we have left, what would happen to our economy if we were not able to trade grain and sell internationally for the products we produce here in Champaign County?
Well, I think the main thing is, our farmers produce enough to feed, I think it's 142 people, each farmer does. We certainly don't have that large of a population here in this country. I think 96% of the world's population lives outside of the United States, and so since we produce more than we can consume, we either have to sell it to someone outside of this country or not produce. And since not producing would be a horrible option because you'd have lots of people without jobs, not just to mention the farmers, but everyone they buy inputs from, to the people up the food chain that process that product into an end food product. So I think the looking at it as there are many, many markets out there, how do we get into them on a fair basis, is a much more positive way to go than to thinking, well, we can't trade with other people because, well, the first thing you're going to have to fight with is the American consumer who wants to buy their motorcycles and their snowmobiles and their flags at Walmart from another country. They don't want to just have one American flag. They want to put one up on Easter. They want to put one up on the 4th of July. They want to put something up on St. Patrick's Day. And if they can't sell products overseas, they're not going to be able to afford to import them.
So for those that say we should stop trading and put the borders, fences up, as far as trading goods, that's not a good idea.
It would be impossible. We'd have to pretty much go to about 50% unemployment in this country because there wouldn't be jobs enough for the people that were left if we weren't trading with other countries.
Yeah. Thank goodness we have an American agriculture that's strong and a transportation that, even though it needs some help, and we're all working toward that, it's going to get better and help out.
That's right.
Thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate you coming from the Illinois Farm Bureau to talk with us today.
Thank you, Dennis.
All right. And we'd like to thank you for listening here on Champaign County Agriculture Today. We hope you've learned a few things about the important industry of agriculture and how it affects us here in Champaign County. Tune in again next time as we explore more issues. I'm Dennis Riggs.